This is a very difficult year due to the coronavirus. As a matter of fact, Dedica Festival has been postponed just 4 days before its start at the beginning of March. Still, I'm very happy to kick off the 26th edition of the festival, although in an unusual way. This edition will focus on Hisham Matar, a writer who won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize and an extraordinary author for his sensitivity and narrative quality. Hisham Matar is connected with us from London. Thank you for being with us and a virtual welcome to Cordenone. In this first meeting, you will meet Benedetta Tobagi, a journalist and writer who is also connected with us. She made a wonderful interview to Hisham Matar that you can find in the Monograph published for the festival. You can have a look at the full program on the website www.dedicafestival.it. So I will stop here with my introduction, but before starting the conversation between Benedetta Tobagi and Hisham Matar, let me thank the partners supporting this event, as well as Anna Nadotti, Carla Polzot, and Gianluca Buttolo for their collaboration, and the publisher Einaudi. They have all given us considerable support. Also, warm thanks to all the school teachers and students who, despite these difficult times, have participated in the school section of Dedica Festival. And big thanks to the Dedica staff and above all to all those who have contributed to the organization of this edition. Last, but definitely not least, thank you very much to the audience and to all those who have given us their continuous affection, help and support over these months, which have encouraged us to continue. So, enjoy the festival and enjoy this conversation, which I'm sure will be extremely interesting. The floor is yours, Benedetta. Thank you, Claudio, and warm greetings from far away to you, to all the people who are listening, and to Hisham Matar. I'm very grateful to Dedica Festival that gave me, and is still giving me, the opportunity to talk to him. It is really an honor and a privilege. Today's conversation will be in line with the spirit of Dedica Festival, as in we'll try to explore in depth the works of an author, his poetics, his relationship with writing, and the common thread of his books. So, Hisham, I will start by asking you to tell us about your portrait of the artist as a young man. There is a beautiful sentence in your memoir, The Return, where you wrote, "I remember once hearing a conductor say that he had always, ever since he was a young boy, heard music in his head, and that it wasn't until he was an adult that he realized this was not the same for everyone else. That has been my experience too, but with words and images." So, starting from here, my question is, how have you become a writer?
Well, good afternoon, good early evening, and thank you so much for having me. Claudio, for your organization and everybody else involved in Dedica. I was looking forward so much to meeting you all in person, and also meeting your audience and students, and I echo Claudio's sentiments and thanks to everybody. How I became a writer, it seems to be a mystery to me. I was saying the other day to my friends' young kids who are atrocious readers. They just don't read. And my friend is struggling to try to convince them to watch maybe a little bit less football and read maybe a little bit more. And I was thinking, when I was their age, so they are about 11 or 12, when I was their age, I wasn't keen on reading. In fact, the word reading itself was negative. To me, this is so strange because now the word reading conjures up so much delight and joy. And it was because I was, like a lot of people, subjected to not particularly creative teaching, teaching that didn't make me love reading. It wasn't really until about 14 that somebody unlocked the door for me, and I fell in with such enthusiasm, but also with a very mysterious feeling, as if I was recognizing myself, as if I was returning to myself rather than entering some new area. And it has really been like that ever since. That writing for me is really the freest space. It's the space where I find the most amount of mobility and energy. So yeah, that's.
And Isham, talking about that space of freedom, you said that writing is like flying, which is a total and complete act, an act of complete abandonment.
Yes, I mean, I think, the word abandonment here is interesting because I think that it is both free, but it obviously demands a great amount of rigor, right? Because we have to construct very carefully these sentences and these realities. But perhaps also we have to abandon, I think, our own objectives, our own immediate, declared, naked objectives, whatever they are, whether it's the approval of others or the advancement of one's ideas, regardless of how important or noble they might seem to us. So it really does invite a meditation on the nature of freedom itself, because freedom seems to me, when equated to art, is not necessarily a place of complete abandonment of any kind of sense of rigor, a kind of surrender to the immediate appetites. But maybe freedom is putting ourselves in the spaces where we find ourselves most exercised, most active, whether intellectually or depending on what it is that we do, or physically. I think Picasso was really so true when he said that all children are artists. Because when you watch them, when you watch how children move, and not only what they say and their drawings, but the way that they move seems to suggest a very particular kind of freedom that I think is I find it very instructive to look at it.
That's interesting. It makes me think about other times when you talked about this strange freedom, let's just say a freedom with constraints. You use expressions which are almost religious. You talked about renewing your vows to writing and about the need for devoting yourself to writing. This is what you've just said, that you need to forget your ego. Is that correct? Is there a sort of religious vow in devoting yourself to writing?
I'm not sure. I notice what you mean. You're right. I mean, there is the language is like all language. It's burdened. It's burdened with previous usage. I don't mean it in the religious way. I think I don't live within a religious practice, and part of me thinks it's a kind of tragedy, actually, because it's because I think religion can give. I mean, with all of its problems, can give a kind of interesting structure to thinking. Anyway, I think we live in a time that I think, like all times, is particularly eloquent in certain subjects and particularly, stupid in other subjects. All epochs have this range of ability of what they can speak about. And I feel we live in a time that is particularly ineloquent about religion. We don't know how to talk about it anymore, including myself. I have no clue how to talk about it. But with my work, dedication, yes, maybe, but I don't. I mean, I really trust not wanting to work. Like if I wake up in the morning and I don't want to work, I think there's a good reason why why I don't want to work, and therefore I shouldn't work. I should go do something else. I've never had an attitude towards it that was careerist, where it's sort of like, this is what I do. I do this every day, regardless whether I have something to write or not. But as you know, of course, very well, and anyone who has written a book knows, that there are stages in writing a book when you are not motivated, sort of the heart, that you've got days where there's a lot of labor and it's complicated and needs a lot of work and almost a physical effort to sort of go through to the next stage. And then there are moments of freedom. So it's not that you don't need dedication, but I rarely think of it that way. I think what I need most of all is a kind of sense of excitement. If I'm excited by the project, that usually carries me through the many years and that it sometimes takes to write it. Certainly, the Return was a book that was maybe all books are like that. All books we write. When somebody says to you, "How long did it take you to write this book?" Maybe the answer all of us should give is the number of years we've lived. It's taken me 49 years to write this. It's because on some level that's true. And with the Return, it very much felt like that. In a very, very unabstract way. And you felt the weight of the past sort of nudging you forward, in the writing of it. So it was a strange book because it was very difficult. It was asking me to do things that were very difficult, things that I didn't want to do, to go to places, to go to moments, to think about things that, of course, you don't want to think about. But also it's asking you to think about them in a very particular way, not just think about them. It was asking you to be very patient with them, to wait, to attend to them with such rigorous curiosity and focus, but also with a level of tenderness a bit, that you don't go to them for immediate answers. You go to them with just curiosity, and you wait for the material to present things up to the surface. That takes time, but it also takes a certain kind of patience about things that make me very impatient. And so there was that difficulty, but then the paradox is that there was the ease of the momentum of it, the way that the book itself is helping you through. And I think all books do that. They work with the writers. I really do think that books have an attitude. Each one has its own attitude, its own way that it moves. And sometimes, this is very rare, most of the times it's not like that, but sometimes it feels as though all that one has to do is just step in line with the book's intentions, and just let it be carried by it, Those are wonderful moments, really fantastic moments. And really at that moment, it becomes uncertain to me who's the author, whether you're the master. Because I think in the Western tradition particularly, we're taught to think of the author as the authority, the person who is pulling the work to... but I think from my experience, most of the time, it's not like that. In fact, the sweetest moments are not like that. They're more like when you are lifted by it, Very difficult thing to speak about these because they're very abstract. So I apologize to everyone if I'm sounding like a madman. I'm not mad.
No, invece posso garantirti
No, on the contrary. I can tell you that, as usual, you're very good at finding the right words. You have very well described that very special moment that writers are familiar with. This is not always the case, but sometimes it's as if the book starts writing itself. You only need to listen carefully, so it's beautiful. It makes me think about something which we have already discussed in the past, that writing is like being very careful not to frighten a wild animal, waiting for the animal to come close to you. And then you have used two words which to me are key to understand your work, as in time and patience. As a reader, and the people who know your work will agree with me, I can say that it is clear how much time and patience you dedicate to your work. And sometimes you show it. For example, when you describe how much attention you put in observing the works of art. But what readers perceive is that when they read your books, they have a space and time for themselves, time to think, time to get in contact with their feelings and complex issues. And this is one of the best experiences that you can have with a book. I don't know whether you agree on that as a reader and a writer.
I am flattered by it. I can't agree because I don't know, but I'm flattered by it. But when I hear you say this, but on the occasion when somebody like you that I admire and whose attention is very careful says something like this, my immediate thought is that it doesn't really belong to me, and I think that's that for two reasons. One, a bad reason, and one I think is a good reason. The bad reason is that for whatever reason, I have always been uncomfortable about taking praise, and I'm not sure that's a good thing, because I think you could imagine a situation where you could take praise in a negative way and become arrogant. But you could also imagine a situation where you could take praise in a positive way, no? And you just think, well, that's really a lovely thing, and I'm going to take this on board, and it will be something that will console and revive and energize me, I mean, in a hypothetical sense, I can imagine that. So I'm critical about this inability of mine, or unease that I have. I don't take it at face value. But the other thing I think is genuine, which is to do with the fact that it really isn't mine. That I feel that everything that occurs, all the arts, all of them, and all knowledge is a result, maybe even not only all knowledge, but all human kindness or human actions, good and bad. A mother's kiss doesn't only belong to her; it belongs to all the mothers before her. And so I think that making part of what we were saying about how those magical moments, hard to speak about moments, when a book starts to somehow seem to be doing at least as much work as you, or maybe most of the work. They're also, I think, a result of a moment when, for whatever reason, we have managed to tap into the wealth of human activity before us. The very simple idea that it is. It is ridiculous and astonishing and magical and just incredibly shocking to be a human being. It's just, to think that there are all of these other people behind you, and that you approach that inheritance with humility and with delight. That literally, I've always felt this. I've always felt all of these. That's why these divisions of, whenever somebody says, Arabic literature or Western literature or Asian literature or Latin American literature, there's a small part of my brain that every time I hear that, think, is there really? Are those distinctions, do they make sense to, of course, to the academy, which I'm a big fan of, to the library, which I'm even a bigger fan of. These are important distinctions, but to the study of literature and of history. But I think on a very personal level, I feel I am, that all of those are mine, all of the artists from all over the world, all over time, are my inheritance, and I think all of us, they are our, and I really do think that we should approach them with the delight of a really wonderful inheritance, and with humility. Of course, it gets more complicated when you turn it to the other side, when you say, by the same token, everything terrible that has happened is also our inheritance. And we have to approach these figures who have committed terrible atrocities, not with the convenience of saying, well, they belong to somebody else, but with the robust, I think, engagement that they are, our brothers and sisters in a very disturbing way, So I think this adventure of being a human being, where you have to somehow carry this incredible wealth of activity, is a serious business, and I think particularly in the arts, one of the things that an artist is doing is that they're opening a space for the past to come in. So that's why sometimes it really doesn't feel like it's yours entirely. Yeah.
Well, literature is one of the most powerful tools we have to understand and enrich our sense of belonging to mankind. So I know that readers like to know who are the favorite writers and the men of letters of the writers that they love. So in this, let's say, universal brotherhood of literature, who are the authors that are most dear to you? And what are the classics that you are rereading right now, if any?
Well, that's a very big question. It changes. I mean, there are some books that have been consistent. Like, there are some writers for whom my interest has been unwavering. And there are some that come in and out, or there are aspects of a writer's work that for whom my interest is unwavering. I think the kind of foundational stones for me are, when I was very young, I used to read a lot of poetry. I used to mainly read poetry. I didn't actually read much prose at all. Outside of what school demanded of me. All the reading that I did out of my own interest was almost all in verse, until the end of school. So until I was 18 or so, all of that was verse, and it was what was available in the library at home, in the books that my parents kept. So I read a lot of modernist Arabic poets of the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. People like Badr Shakir al-Sayyab, for example, al-Bayati. And those people then led me to the people that influenced them. So I went to T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and so on. And for a while, it's a bit like with my interest with music. It's a kind of a strange trajectory because, the first time I found classical music interesting was when I listened to a concert by Schnittke, Alfred Schnittke. And then I discovered that Schnittke was influenced by Beethoven. So I went to Beethoven from Schnittke, which is very bizarre, right? So it was similar a bit with this in the sense that I went back through the modernists, really. So Virginia Woolf, for me, was very significant, continues to be. Joseph Conrad is a writer that has never left me, from the first love affair, really. And Marcel Proust is another one that to me is inexhaustible, in the way that he exemplifies a quality that you find in great art. And to me, it's the most both mysterious, but also it's the most admirable quality, which is that it's a paradox. He seems to write as if he knows everything, and at the same time, as if he knows nothing. So he seems to approach the material with a great wealth of sentimental, intellectual, philosophical energy and knowledge and subtlety and great appetite. There's nothing that he's not interested in, just so much appetite. And yet with the sort of novice innocence and playfulness of somebody that has absolutely no idea what the thing is. So he looks at something and he's always wondering what it is, in a very genuine sense, so I find him really, really wonderful. I lament the fact that I don't know what it's like in Italy, but in the English language, in Britain and in America, Proust has like the place of a kind of marginal interest, a very admirable interest, but a very strange, bizarre interest. So people never read him, basically. and I think that's a shame, because he does, of course, put you off, because he has, his novel In Search of Lost Time is so huge, made up of several volumes, and not the easiest book to read, perhaps, on the face of it. But it's a book that really, I think, tries to redefine what reading is. It changes time. It changes your appetites as a reader of what it is that you want to find. So there are writers like that, like Marcel Proust and Joseph Conrad, for example, whom I would read whenever I would. There's a lovely story about Lampedusa walking around Palermo with a volume of Shakespeare. That whenever he'd see something ugly, he'd pull it out and read a couple lines, and I have that sort of relationship to Proust and Joseph Conrad. Like if I'm totally in despair or depressed, or I pick it, I just read a few lines, and it somehow consoles me. And I think the reason it consoles me is, and maybe the reason why Lampedusa liked to read a couple of lines of Shakespeare whenever he saw something that upset him, is that in those works, what you get is the opposite of carelessness, the opposite of everything that any cruel act requires, you can't do something cruel without, on some level, being careless or thoughtless, or you decide not to imagine what the other person is thinking. You decide not to want to imagine, for example, what those people, suffering, wherever they may be, you cannot do an act of cruelty or injustice, I think, without requiring a kind of thought, very, very violent, could be passive, but nonetheless violent, thoughtlessness. And those works are the opposite. They have great care and thought and precision and eloquence,
Guarda, quello che dicevi di Proust rispetto
As to the way
alla
Proust is perceived in the Anglo-Saxon world, I can tell you that to the Italians, Proust's readers are like a sort of religious sect. So it's a very small group of passionate people, but also, let's say, very closed and very self-aware. I remember a funny story at university. There was a language philosophy professor who once came to class after a long illness and confessed that he had read À la recherche by Proust after breaking his leg because he had never managed to read it before. So, you mentioned Joseph Conrad, which leads me to a crucial theme of your works. Joseph Conrad is one of the authors exploring the literature of exile, just like you. In your works, exile plays a central role and is dealt with in many different ways. And what I find very interesting is that exile is both a very specific experience, but also has universal resonance. Can you expand on that?
Yes, I mean, the interesting thing about that distinction or that classification, exile, is that both I have a very, I don't know why, but maybe because the word has become antiquated, So I have a slight distrust of it, I wonder how useful it is anymore. I'm not sure. Yet it becomes unavoidable. It's how else can you describe this situation? I don't know why, but your question made me remember this friend of mine who's a painter, and he, when he was 16 years old, had a tutor who was himself a very successful, famous painter. And my friend painted a picture when he was 16, and he was very proud of it. He put a lot in this picture. And the tutor came to look at it, and he pointed to about a foot, about 30 centimeters to the right of the picture, away from the picture. And he said, "What I'm wondering about is what's happening here." And I've always thought, actually, it's a very good way to look at paintings, that paintings are a select segment of an activity that goes beyond the frame, And I think it's also a really interesting way of looking at books that way. That books too decide when you start, when you finish, what you include, what you don't include. And there's a whole other stuff that's on the fringes of it that it can be conscious of in some way. And maybe I thought about that when you asked the question, because in a sense, the fear of the exile or the anxiety of the exile is that they are being forbidden this sense of connectedness. That what they're focusing on, their painting or their book, is not only a selection of a vast network, but it's literally a divorced area, and so, I've often worried about that. And also, you have to remember that I grew up on very strong ideas of the novel as a vernacular art form, as that it does come out of the earth, it comes out of society, out of a very particular knowledge of custom and ways of being, mannerisms and language, of course. And so I've always had this quiet anxiety about this very peculiar situation of being from somewhere else, writing in a different language. Most of my readers have very little to do with the things that I write about. It's a very, it's a very strange situation. But then you realize that the things that you're really writing about have nothing really to do with place or even a specific culture, but something else that is more connected, So with time, sorry, I'm trying to describe a lot of things in a short time, but I started off with a great deal of, I started off finding this a real problem, and it really weighed heavily on me. And with time, I have started to only be interested in the things that it allows, and explore the things that it allows, I think it's like all, anyway, I don't want to trivialize it, but it's like all relationships in a sense, that you start, whether it's your relationship with your career or with your subject or with a person. And then maybe in the early stages, you're aware of the limitations of it. You think, really? Is that what's expected of me? I'm just only going to do this? And then after a while, you discover that actually the limitations are driving you to subjects that are very, very interesting, And Joseph Conrad is magnificent in that, because there's just a lot of energy in the way that he comes at things, and his appropriation of the English language with such force and artistry, and he doesn't, he doesn't sound English. He sounds very strange. He sounds, he's writing in English, but he's really writing in Joseph Conrad. It's another language, and there are moments when he tries to adopt a cliche. He does that very rarely, but I think because he thinks if I do this, everybody's going to think I really have it. So he would adopt a cliche, but he would misuse the cliche a little bit, just a little bit, in a way that is very strange. So he is an example of somebody who has found a lot of freedom, and a lot of facility, notwithstanding all of his losses, So I find that very, very interesting. Yeah. And also, I also think poverty, being, I also now look back at my younger self, who used to be so worried about what I took to be my poverty, the things I didn't have, right? But now with time, I'm just much more interested. I think poverty is a real, genuine, I'm not trying to sentimentalize this at all, but poverty is, a genuine facility, I'm now slightly more suspicious of the position that assumes a great deal of wealth. Imagine you come to the page with all this wealth, I'm not sure if that's any better. It might be, but I'm not sure, so.
Your reference to wealth leads us to another clear theme in your books that focus on and talk about dictatorships. When talking about exile, you explore the condition of, let's say, existential alienation. But in your novels, there is also a focus on dictatorships, which you also experienced yourself. In any case, it seems to me that what you're really interested in is the exploration of power, and in particular the impact of power and the arbitrary exercise of a certain type of power on the human soul. And you also deal with the impact of power on the people belonging to the privileged circle of power. And here I'm thinking about the wonderful pages of The Return where you describe Gaddafi's son.
Yes, no, I think that's quite accurate. I think, um, growing up in a dictatorship, or growing up in under a system of dictatorship is really pretty awful. It's something that affects all different aspects of your life. It affects the way people engage with one another. It affects the currency of power, the currency of freedom. It also affects something that's very subtle and very difficult to describe, which is the quality of the silences, because I think one of the ways that we could read silence is an invitation into possibilities, right? So even in a casual conversation, we fall silent, and the moment we fall silent, we are both being invited into the next thing that we might say, and we could go any which way. And depending on the nature of that relationship, you could have a wide repertoire of places that you could go. Talk about this, and then we can now talk about food. Then we can talk about music. We can talk about art and so on. The quality of the silences in the dictatorship I've always found to be restrictive because they are overburdened with questions of what's allowed and what's not allowed. Censorship becomes not only institutional, but it becomes personal, And in my first novel, for example, In the Country of Men, I was very interested in that because I was interested in how these things affect the private moment, not necessarily in the political, machinery of them, but more in how they infiltrate the very, very personal moment, the quiet moments, relationships between family members, between friends, between children. How do they materialize there? And also I think the other thing that is hard to describe is that dictatorship is also an education. It seeks to educate the public into a certain way of thinking. But we notice it, I think, even if you haven't hadn't suffered the indignity of going through a dictatorship, you know that political structures, even in a democracy, change the conversation. They change the language, the words that we use, the subjects that we talk about. You notice, for example, in Italy, how when Berlusconi came in, the language started to change. The political discourse started to change, right? Here, right now, with Boris Johnson, you notice it very gradually. In its early days of his premiership, but you notice it very gradually that there's a certain tone to how things are spoken about that reflects a bit the kind of sloganish way that he thinks, So political discourse is incredibly powerful. That's why democracy should be treated with great seriousness, and engaged with great, energy, and never sort of treated with cynicism, because it really affects so much about our culture. It authors it, So that was sort of, if you like, my early education into it. But you're right. My in the writing, I'm interested in what that says about power and about all the things that exist in the most private of relationships. Dominance, control. The translation tests, what they call love tests. I'm not going to tell you what I want, but I'm going to wait for you to figure it out. Those kind of sentiments, right? So yeah, no, you're right.
Power and colonial power. To Italian readers, The Return is a precious reading because it enables them to become familiar with a topic which is hardly discussed, that is, the faults and responsibilities of Italian colonialism in Libya. In late spring, early summer 2020, there was a strange form of violence throughout the world, with a general attack against and demolition of statues that represented the colonial or racist past of the various countries. What do you think about this wave of protests against those symbols?
Di protesta contro I simboli di quella storia.
I mean, I think, you know, the amazing thing to me is how history is incredibly alive, and it's impossible to, I'm stating the obvious, but it's impossible to bury it. That it's such a genius. It's always finding ways to express itself in the present. It's always present, in other words. But then it seems to me the choice is not to bury it or not. The choice is how, in what way do you want it to be present? What are the ways that can be constructive, educative, ways that can genuinely, you know, shape the present and the future in a positive way? Because if you don't do that, then it's not going to go away. It's just going to shape the present and the future in ways that aren't positive. So, for example, you know, what you mentioned about the relationship between, not between Italy and Libya, but between contemporary Italian knowledge of, you know, past deeds in Libya is important because it is very much part of the present. It's part of the Italian present and it's part of the Libyan present, you know. And a lack of knowledge of it will blind us, you know, to some of the things that have shaped the present. It's not to come out of. The bell is ringing. Shall I pause until it stops, or are you enjoying the bell?
Oh, I think we're enjoying it. Ci piacciono le campane, molto brevi.
I live right next to it. You know, the thing that I've always found curious, I mean, I you know this, Benedetta, because we know each other a little, but I absolutely adore Italy. I have such an intimate relationship to it. I love the country and I've known it for a very long time and have been going there since I was a boy. So no excuse for not speaking Italian. But what has been fascinating to me about it is how it has these blind spots to its past deeds in Libya and Eritrea. I mean, really profound blind spots. I mean, even friends of mine who are, you know, anti-colonialists in a general sense. They're university educated, traveled around the world, still know very little about what their country has done in Libya. And I say this not from a point of view to make my Italian friends feel bad. I say it because to me, it's a genuine puzzle. It's so fascinating. Why is this the case? It's such an interesting European example. It's a fascinating European example where there's this blind spot. And of course, now things are changing. You have a young generation of really curious and very, very able Italian academics, historians who are looking into it. But I've been, for example, very interested in how, you know, that wonderful generation of Italian filmmakers, you know, I've watched all of their films, you know, I've watched every single film that Fellini has made, and even the films that he's written, and every single film that Michelangelo Antonioni has made, and Rossellini, etc., all of that generation, that incredible generation of great artists, right? Pasolini and all these guys who were genuinely interested in Italian culpability, right? They were interested in the problems of power, as well as interested in so many different things, other things. Yet not one of them mentions anything about, that to me, there's got to be a historical structural reason for that. I just don't know what it is. And I've always found it such an interesting question to engage with, Why is that the case? It's a really interesting question to me. And I'm sure there are reasons, some of them historical reasons, to do with Italy's experience of World War II, its experience at home of what was happening there, that some of my Italian friends describe their experience of that time as if Italy itself was the subject of its own colonial endeavors, and all of that. Nonetheless, those explanations don't satisfy totally. You're still curious. Why is this the case? The other reason why I'm an advocate for that curiosity, not only because I believe the past forms the present, but also because I think it's such an interesting story. It's such a fascinating story, and a lot of really brutal things, but also very interesting things have happened. So that's the reason why I'm interested in it. Sorry, Benedetta, there was a second part to your question. It was about colonialism, and the other one was what?
The statues.
Oh yes, the statues. Yeah.
How does this relate to the demolition and the wave of violence against statues?
I think they're very connected because it's to do with a kind of, to state the obvious, I am not an advocate for violence. I'm not an advocate for taking the law into your own hand. That's just to be stupidly academic about it. I'm not an advocate of these things. I hope it goes without saying. But I also think that when you deny a conversation, like in the case of Britain, it's the only one I can speak about with some degree of accuracy. The statue that was pulled down in Bristol, people I know have been campaigning for the last 20 years. And by campaigning, what they do is they write polite letters, they petition, they offer solutions. Leave the statue, but let's change the writing to explain the historical context. Let's take the statue and put it in a museum. Let's leave the statue, but offer educative information in our culture that will change the way that we see this statue of a man who was a brutal slave trader who has given a lot of money to the city of Bristol, and therefore there's a statue of him, but there's a square named after him and a building and street and so on. And after 20 years of not engaging with it, this blew up. So I think the interesting lesson to take from it, and what I hope will come out of these protests, is that they become an invitation for a robust, sincere engagement, not a cynical engagement, And the fact, and I hope I'm wrong, but the fact that I would argue that the majority of indigenous Europeans, the majority of Brits, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Germany is an anomaly in this, and it presents a different example of engaging robustly with the pains of the past. But I would argue the majority of these other countries, they either never think about how their countries have brutalized the world for a long time, and how their countries are based, their economies are based on theft, great amount of theft, as well as great inventiveness and great hard work, of course, but a great amount of brutality and theft. They either never think about it, or if they think about it, they're either indifferent or sometimes secretly proud, right? The cliche, there's a wonderful book by V.S. Naipaul had a brother called Vichy Naipaul who wrote a wonderful book called North of South, I think, or South of North. I might be getting it wrong. But it's a book where he travels throughout Africa and tries to think about the colonial legacy. And there's the scene of these English people living the high life in Nairobi. And the particular pleasure that they take in the fact that the bathtubs have two separate tabs like you have in Britain, you know, the cold water and the hot water are separate. You know, these little subtle things, I think, tell you a lot about a kind of sentimental, in the negative sense, a sentimentalist, you know, attitude to the past. I'm not saying that's the majority, but you know, there's very little robust engagement with that. You know, because people, you know, Europeans aren't unique. I mean, it's just people in general don't like to be reminded of their shame. I mean, who likes that? We all like to walk around feeling proud and like to be selective, you know. But the trouble is that the world is changing with such, you know, speed, and European capitals are becoming so cosmopolitan, and that past cannot be ignored. It has to be engaged with, you know, with such sincerity, because on the other side of it, there's something really beautiful, you know, a possibility of having societies that are, you know, genuinely collaborative, you know, genuinely tolerant of difference, not only racial and cultural difference, but sexual and religious difference. No, so and this is not. It doesn't seem to me a moment of that will just happen, you know, with time. There seems to be a particular urgency behind it, that is to do with, you know, with the accumulation of these events. Sorry, Benedetta, you ask such good questions quickly. I'm
No,
now.
sono...
This is the cliche of the Arabic man who just talks forever, right?
Questo è il piacere.
This is the pleasure of Italian-style conversation that can go on well into the night. Next time we meet in person, we will have a lot of tea and we'll continue until late at night. Under these circumstances, and looking at Claudio Cataruzza, our conversation is now coming to an end, and now I want to satisfy my own curiosity, and I imagine the curiosity of all the readers who love your books. So, are you writing a new novel? And what does it talk about? Can you tell us something?
I am writing a new novel, and I would love to tell you what it's about. But I've always found it very difficult to say anything about what I'm working on. And it's not because I'm superstitious. At least I don't think so. It's more because I think when the engine is open, you know, and the book is being put together, all the language belongs to it. You know, even the language about it belongs to it. So I think there's a reason why it's just it's very difficult. I had a very dear friend of mine, a wonderful Irish writer called Dermot Healy, who passed away a few years back, and he had written this fantastic novel called Goat's Song, and everybody loved it. And his publisher wanted him to sign a deal for his next novel, and they asked him for a synopsis. He didn't have a synopsis, but he was a good writer, so he just wrote a few lines that sounded so great because he needed the money to write. And they signed the contract, and it was like a curse. He couldn't work for many years. It was like a curse. So I think maybe it's a bit like that you think that the language that belongs to the book until it's finished. So now it will feel like stealing it from it, whereas later, I hope, when I finish it, I will borrow some language from it and talk to you about it. I would love that very much.
Ok, non vedo l'ora.
Okay, I'm looking forward to reading it. Now let me say goodbye to you and to the people listening to Dedicafestival with the verses of a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. When I read them, they made me think about what I felt reading your books, and so I would like to close with them. The poem is entitled On Patience, and ends up like this. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. And the point is to leave everything. Leave the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Thank you again, Hisham, and warm greetings to you all from the Dedica Festival.